A sexual predator turned serial killer is on the prowl in Middle America. His crimes are as devastating as they are bold. One of the key pieces of evidence that links him to his last victim will be tested and proven in 1 hour. The worst crimes imaginable can occur in the least likely places. But regardless of culture, geography, social or economic status, murder is murder. At the most extreme are the killers who take lives as part of their sexual perversion. These individuals carry out the most heinous of crimes with forethought, precision, and planning. They are usually completely without remorse. Such is the case of Robert Leroy Anderson of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Ultimately, what ends up convicting Robert Leroy Anderson is a remarkable discovery, using the simplest of ingredients put to the test in the crime lab in an experiment that takes only 1 hour to complete.
Sioux Falls is the largest city in the state of South Dakota, and it was an excellent place to grow up. In fact, the city had twice been ranked by national magazines as being the #1 city in the United States of its size to live based on education, housing, low crime rate.
For a lot of years, particularly from 1995 through 2003, 2010, South Dakota averaged about 1 murder, 1 intentional homicide a month statewide. So not a lot. You get some, you just don't get very many of them. We just have a relatively low crime rate compared to other jurisdictions.
As the details of Robert Leroy Anderson's case become known, fear and repulsion grips the entire state of South Dakota and beyond.
We lived about an hour and a half away at the time, but it was very big news. People were concerned. It made the headlines in a tri-state area, and we followed the case rather closely, but there were a lot of details we didn't know until we started investigating the case.
Authors Phil and Sandy Hammond couldn't help but be drawn into the mystery surrounding Anderson's case.
We had written a couple other national bestsellers, true crime, that occurred in this area. And as we were traveling around the Midwest, we had many requests to write a book on Robert Leroy Anderson and the serial killings out of Sioux Falls. But we assumed somebody had already written a book about it. It was such a huge story.
Anderson is born and raised in Sioux Falls area. As a younger man, he worked out of state for a time, but returned home, married, and had a family. Despite the outward appearance of normalcy, Anderson had a dark side that he could sometimes barely conceal. This dark side manifested itself in spousal abuse and often made even his closest friends turn away.
Robert Leroy Anderson came from a very dysfunctional family. One of his relatives told us that Robert and his 2 brothers were taught by their father that women had no meaning in life. They were objects, they were not to be respected, and Robert took his sexual fantasies to the next level with that kind of an attitude towards women. The family was so dysfunctional, there was a time when Robert Leroy Anderson, his 2 brothers, and his father were all incarcerated in the state penitentiary at the same time. He grew up actually not too far from where I lived, kind of a lower middle income area. Ironically, very close to the state penitentiary. He actually went to the same high school I went to.
When we first started investigating with this, we thought maybe he was operating at a lower intellectual level. He was actually very intelligent. He was in some advanced classes in school.
He went on to be an engineering major postgraduate, and his professor said he performed very well. But Robert Leroy Anderson had a dark side. He started sharing with friends as young as 14 his desire to abduct and bind and rape and murder women. So he had a warped sexuality from a young age.
He'd try to find people who maybe shared the same ideas he had, but most of his friends kind of wrote it off as some really extreme, maybe guy talk that had gotten out of hand.
It has been proven that if the seeds of sexual perversion exist in a person, they're often planted very early in life. There'll always be the argument of nature versus nurture, but researchers often find that there seems to be a definitive event that sparks what we would consider an illness in that person.
He did have not a split personality, but he was able to come across as one kind of person to his wife, another kind of person to the people he worked with, and then he could keep these dark fantasies hidden beneath the surface and only reveal them to close friends who he thought he could trust.
Most convicted killers do not have these crazy fantasies. They don't have a premeditated wish to repeat the offenses over and over, and even less do they tell people about their weird desires.
The fantasies that he had were enough for him for a while, and after a while, that was not enough. And he had to move to that next step of actually abducting someone. And he took a lot of time in fantasizing about how he would do that. And people who've worked with sexual sadists say he was probably obsessed with those thoughts from the time he woke up until he went to bed. It was all he could think about was how he was going to abduct someone, who he was going to abduct, and what he would do after he had abducted a particular woman that he had his sights on.
He started developing a plan. He started sharing with friends. He wanted a co-conspirator to get involved with him as he became a young adult. And he started developing all these different ways that he was going to abduct women.
Anderson's first kill is in August 1994, and it is a crime that baffles authorities and remains unsolved. He hatches his plan in secrecy, and it calls for an accomplice, someone he already has confided in, and who is easily manipulated. This person is Glenn Walker.
Robert Leroy Anderson worked at John Morrell, which is a meatpacking plant. He was a refrigeration technician. And these crimes that he committed were not anonymous. He set his sights on somebody. So some of the people who were involved did work at John Morrell meatpacking plant.
In the early 1990s, Larissa and Bill Demansky and their two young children were living in the Ukraine. Now, the Ukraine was going through a very difficult economic time at that point in history, and a good job was very difficult to find. So they qualified for asylum to be able to come to the United States, and they settled in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Both Larissa and Bill landed jobs, good-paying jobs, at the John Morrell meatpacking plant.
And everyone just loved her. She was really the light of the life in her particular department. Once Robert Leroy Anderson set his sights on Larissa, he spent a lot of time planning exactly what he was going to do. And his plan at this point involved having somebody help him to abduct Larissa.
There's no such thing as a minor sexual offense. There are just different degrees of severity of sexual offenses, from the random, spontaneous act at a school function, a college party, to this premeditated, long-term planning of multiple victims and end up killing them at the end of the sexual issue. That is the far end of the pendulum of sexual offenses.
They live with dark thoughts and impulses that can often become obsessions. They observe and they plan, and they not only choose victims that suit their ideal, but these individuals constantly search for opportunities to get away with it, to act on their base instincts and not get caught. The whole point is to commit these crimes, get away with them, then act again. This is the mark of a serial predator.
Robert Leroy Anderson of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, is a small-town monster with no regard for women. He harbors disturbing fantasies about abducting women, binding, then raping them, before ultimately killing them and concealing their remains. He lives with these terrible impulses and brazenly begins sharing them, in hushed tones with trusted friends.
Robert Leroy Anderson was the stereotypical serial killer. He started sharing these bizarre fantasies, and they became fueled through bondage and rape pornography.
Larissa Dumansky and her husband had come to America to obtain a better life for them and their children. Working at the John Morrell meatpacking plant, she and her husband are forced to work opposite shifts in order to care for their small children. It is while she is on shift that Larissa first meets Robert Leroy Anderson. It is this meeting that will lead to his obsession and ultimately her tragic end of life.
So he and Glenn Walker come up with a plan that when Larissa is leaving the meatpacking plant at about 1 o'clock in the morning, that they're going to be waiting for her. And they had flattened her tire, and when she comes out, there's nobody else happens to be going to that area of the parking lot. It's a huge parking lot. So as she's approaching her door and had evidently put her keys in the lock, Robert Leroy Anderson comes up behind her and grabs her, and there's a struggle, and his friend Glenn Walker helps get duct tape around her hands and her feet, and they get her in the trunk.
It's very strange that someone who is taking these violent, fatal steps towards a female victim is going to tell another person and employ them to help him. That's almost unheard of. It's well planned out. It's at the end of a shift, at the end of the night. It's in the far end of the parking lot. He is still concerned that he can't overpower her by himself. He wants no mistake. So he employs Walker to go with him to force her into the vehicle.
And as they're driving away, Glenn Walker gets cold feet and he says, I want out of this. I don't want to be a part of it anymore. Well, Robert Leroy Anderson doesn't need him anymore. So he drops Glenn Walker off at his house, and then he takes Larissa to a predetermined location.
We'll never really understand why Glenn Walker agreed to help, but clearly Anderson has some very persuasive power over his friend. It's very telling that Walker changes his mind after the abduction, only going partially down this dark path with Anderson. It might suggest that his moral compass isn't quite as damaged as Anderson's. Regardless of why, Walker bails, leaving Anderson to finish the job on his own.
He takes Larissa to a predetermined location, which was probably around Lake Vermilion. He does torture and kill her. He wraps duct tape around her head and her mouth, leaving her eyes open, and she suffocates. Then he puts her back in the car. He goes back home. He sleeps for a while, goes back to get Glenn Walker and says, "You need to help me bury this body." And so they go to a bush that Robert Leroy Anderson had picked out around Lake Vermilion. They dig a shallow grave. They put Larissa there. And in that way, he feels he has incriminated Glenn Walker enough that Glenn won't tell what happened.
Larissa and her husband were working different hours. That allowed them time to be with their young daughters. And Larissa was working the 5 in the afternoon till 1 o'clock in the morning shift. But on that morning, Larissa did not show up. Bill woke up and she was not in bed. He got up wondering if she left and went to the store. He waited. The morning went on, and Bill started calling friends to see where Larissa was. Nobody had seen her. So Bill got in his vehicle, and he started driving through the Morrell's parking lot. He eventually finds Larissa's minivan. There's a flat tire on it, and her car keys, the van keys, are hanging in the driver's side door lock. So immediately he's alarmed. He contacts authorities, and an investigation starts right away. They start interviewing people that got off work with her, interviewing supervisors, but Larissa has just vanished.
Anytime you get a missing person, the obvious is to go to the family, and you have to either confirm or eliminate them as potential persons of interest. So in this case, the husband makes the complaint. He's distraught. He has an alibi, he's home with the children. It's fairly easy to eliminate him as a prime suspect. Now your circle has to go out. It has to start going wider and wider within the community to determine who did this.
The investigators thought, well, did she have a boyfriend? Did she just run off? People that knew her knew that wasn't true. There was a huge community search for Larissa. Posters were put up. Armies of people searched anywhere that a body could be dumped nearby. And it went on and on. But again, she just totally vanished. It runs cold. They have no clues whatsoever or how to find Larissa Dumansky.
Having achieved his first kill and never once being treated as a suspect in Larissa's disappearance, Robert Leroy Anderson becomes emboldened. Just 3 months later, in November of 1994, Anderson plans his next attack, and again he manages to manipulate Walker into being his accomplice. As investigators come to learn, Robert Leroy Anderson's hunting schedule can be tracked by his days off, requested at work. He always ensures he has an extra day off. This becomes a key piece of evidence.
One of his plans was to disable a woman's vehicle by flattening a tire, either in a parking lot so they couldn't hop in and get away, or he made sharpened objects. One of his plans was to get an accomplice with walkie-talkies. They would be in 2 separate vehicles. They would follow a woman. The car would go ahead of the female, get far enough ahead to stop the car, lay the tire popper in the middle of the road, and then when the vehicle hit the tire popper and the tire was disabled, then they would abduct the woman.
He obviously did his homework. He knew how to color these. He knew where to put them. It matches the highway color that they're traveling on. If it was a color that contrasted against the pavement, and when you're driving, you see anything show up on the pavement, so you turn around it. If it was the same color as the pavement, you would not see it and go right over it, especially if it's a thin, sharp project that's facing the tire.
On a pitch-black night, they target a young woman named Amy Anderson, no relation to Robert.
Amy Anderson was a beautiful businesswoman who was having dinner with a friend, and she lived outside of Sioux Falls. So after dinner, she's driving her friend back home, and a car comes behind them and is kind of looking in the window, and it passes them and pulls right in front of them, and Amy tries to back off, and they get this cat and mouse game going of one car passing the other, and Amy's just wanting to back off and have this person leave. Well, as they're going down the road, the car pulls ahead. They continue down the road, and she hears a clunk, like something bounced underneath the car. And they thought they ran over something in the road. She gets to her friend's house and realizes that her tire is going flat. But she says, it's okay, I think I can get to a gas station, get it pumped up, or get home or something. So she heads back home, or heads to a gas station. And before she gets there, her tire goes flat. So she pulls over, she opens up her trunk, and she's getting a jack out, and she is going to fix the tire. And just then, that same car pulled behind her, and she thinks, oh, it's a good Samaritan. You know, he maybe is feeling guilty about driving crazy like that, and he's going to help me. And she says, oh, you know, the jack is in the trunk, and he doesn't make a move. So she reaches in to get it, and he comes and he grabs her from behind. Now, he had Glenn Walker with him, but Glenn Walker got cold feet. He froze.
The flaw of a tire popper is that it can either be quick or it can be a slow leak, which would allow you to be able to escape if it doesn't work. In this case, the tire didn't go quite flat enough. She was able to avoid them after they tried to capture her.
Amy struggles and she pushes, and with all her might, she manages to get away. She sees headlights coming and she flags down the car, and they do stop, and they let her get in the car and they take off. They call the police, but Amy's not able to give much of a description. It was nighttime. She couldn't really see either man. She just knew there was 2 of them.
This near miss is investigated by police and reported on by the media. Anderson and Walker again avoid being connected to the crime, but now Walker is completely unnerved. He tells Robert Anderson that he's out. He won't be an accomplice to any more of his planned abductions.
Anderson is now a serial killer rapist. He had one success in his mind. He's had a failure. He knows that the police are now looking in the area. So he expands his search. He's still going to continue. There's nothing to deter this guy from killing and raping women. And he now seeks out another victim on his own. Will have no witnesses. The weird part of these serial rapist killers, it's not any victim. It has to be a special victim. They have to want this person and do this person, A, because of opportunity or appearance.
It's August 1996 in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Nearly 2 years have gone by since Robert Leroy Anderson's last attempt to kidnap a woman with the intent of raping, torturing, and murdering her. He has one victim to his credit, Larissa Dumansky, but a second abduction attempt fails, and he's lost his accomplice, Glenn Walker. Anderson is forced to lay low and devise a new plan.
Anderson has been forced to rethink his tactics, but he's still haunted by the need to do harm. Sexual predators can't just turn it off. They need to strike again. Someone like Anderson would constantly be looking for another opportunity to commit even more horrific violence against an unsuspecting victim.
Piper Streyle and her husband are the quiet, God-fearing type of folks who just recently returned to South Dakota. She's a dependable pillar of her community, and at first blush, Piper's disappearance seems completely random and out of character for her. There is little to suggest the awful planning that goes into the crime behind her disappearance. When the details become known, it shocks even the most experienced law enforcement personnel, including former Attorney General for South Dakota, Larry Long.
Piper Streyle was kidnapped on July 29th of 1996. She and her husband Vance, their goal was to start a church out in the western part of McCook County, which is about 20 miles west of Sioux Falls. And they had a place that they called Prairie View Bible Camp, which was a trailer house and a lean-to. They didn't have a lot of money. They were just getting started, as young couples often do. And they lived there in their trailer house, husband and wife and 2 kids. They had a little girl named Shayna who was about 6 weeks short of her 4th birthday. And they had a little boy named Nathan who was 2 years old the day before his mother disappeared.
How this friendly, outgoing, and beautiful young mother suddenly becomes targeted by a deranged killer is almost completely random.
Robert Leroy Anderson's father was living out near the Lake Vermilion that was west and north of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So Robert had to drive by the Streyle resident quite often when he went out to see his father.
And when he was driving down that road, he would sometimes see a woman, he didn't know her name. He would see her out in the yard getting the mail or something like that.
Now, Piper was petite, she was pretty, she was actually a former high school homecoming queen.
What begins as a fleeting glance of Piper Streyle in her own yard becomes fuel for the darkest of Anderson's thoughts. He increases the frequency of his trips to see his father and slow down or pause near the Streyle residence. With every sighting of the petite, attractive young mother, Anderson becomes increasingly obsessed. His urge is out of control. He begins planning her abduction and violent end.
Now, he didn't have Glenn Walker to help him anymore, so he had to come up with a different plan. He got to know her patterns, her husband's patterns, the family's patterns, and so one Friday, he shows up at the door, and he knocks, and he's surprised to see her husband answer the door, because he was not supposed to be home. He would normally be at work.
By chance, Anderson shows up at the Streyle home. On the same week, they're hosting a youth Bible camp. Piper's husband, Vance, is home, taking time off work to help run the camp.
And Robert Leroy Anderson stammered around and said, do you guys run some kind of a camp or something here? And Vance said, yeah, well, we run a Bible camp. And Vance notices in the driveway a black Bronco, an SUV, pure black, flat black. Even the rims were painted black. The bumpers were painted black. He thought it was very strange. So Vance says, well, why don't you give me your name and phone number, and we'll get a hold of you, and give me your address, and we'll get you some information.
Robert Leroy Anderson is kind of thrown. He's not good on his feet like that. He kind of stumbles around. So Robert Leroy Anderson does write down his name and his phone number, and he gives that to Vance, and Vance knows where he puts it. He puts it in a drawer where he keeps that kind of thing.
It's a classic mistake. Here's a very intelligent killer, but I think he was so unnerved by a man answering the door that he just made a classic mistake and wrongly gave his name and address and phone number on that sheet of paper.
No crime is committed yet, but it's damning evidence for Anderson to leave behind. Now he's more compelled than ever that Piper will be his next victim. And if killing Vance as a witness is necessary, he's prepared to do that too.
This is the first mistake. He writes his name and phone number on a paper. Not to be deterred, he still continues on with his plan to capture the wife and kill her.
Anderson has now seen Piper Streyle up close, and this is fuel for his darkest thoughts about what he wants to do to her. He's not about to just abandon his plan and go home at this point. He needs to up the ante and deal with Vance if need be.
So then Robert Leroy Anderson has to go home and he has to adjust his plan. And this time he brings a gun with him, a pistol with him, and he decides if Vance opens the door that he's going to shoot him.
So the next Monday, on July 29th, he goes back to the Striley residence, but now he's brought the 9mm handgun with him. Robert Leroy Anderson knocks on the door. Little Shayna, who's almost 4 years old, answers the door. Robert pushes his way in, and he meets Piper coming down the hallway. He yells at her to get on the floor. Piper refuses. He shoves Piper back down the hallway and into one of the children's bedrooms. He finally gets Piper wrestled to the ground on her stomach, and he handcuffs her, hands and ankles.
And she yells to her children, run and hide, and they do. And he takes Piper, carries her out over his shoulder.
When they get out to the parking lot and he tries to put Piper in the vehicle, Piper is still struggling and fighting. Robert Leroy Anderson shoots the 9mm handgun off near her to frighten her some more. The semi-automatic 9mm spits a spent shell casing into the Striley driveway. But the sound of the pistol unnerves Robert Leroy Anderson. He needs to get out of there. He looked for the spent shell casing, but he couldn't find it. So he puts Piper in the vehicle and hops in and takes her away. He's taken her to a secluded area that he has along the Big Sioux River. Very vegetated, very tall trees. And on the way there, Piper tries appealing to him. She tells him she's menstruating. He says, I don't care about that. She says, my husband's the only man I've ever been with. Please let me go. He laughs that off. He takes Piper to this secret crime location.
He spent some time putting this plan together. He's built a board where you would be able to secure a person to it with metal clamps and straps to be able to put her in a position for bondage for sex. He has handcuffs, he has duct tape, and he's able to capture her.
Remember, these cases aren't about sex. They're more about domination, control, and power. Anderson can only feel powerful when he's in control, and that means the victim must be helpless. He needs them to feel terror. He wants them to beg for their lives. It's the stuff of nightmares.
What happens next is horrific.
He did have duct tape around her head at some point. He slowly strangled Piper.
And rapes her repeatedly and sexually tortures her.
Every sexual sadist turned killer needs something from their victim. Anderson needed to dominate. He needed to feel powerful. He needed to frighten his victim. All of these things fed the sick appetites of Robert Leroy Anderson.
As a sexual sadist, the pain gave him pleasure. It's one of the hardest things to read about and talk about.
Piper Striley is abducted from her Sioux Falls, South Dakota home on the morning of July 29, 1996. The violent incident occurs in front of her children, ages 4 and 2. The children are immobilized with fear, having hidden inside the house, as their mother instinctively told them to, while fighting for her survival. Her abductor, Robert Leroy Anderson, eventually drives Piper to a secluded area, where he rapes and kills her. It is hours before anyone even realizes Piper is missing. Piper's husband heads directly home to find a police officer waiting with his children. His concern is obviously focused on his wife's whereabouts, but likely quickly shifts to what his kids, especially his daughter, just witnessed.
She talks about how a mean man took Mommy, and she gives them the information about a man in a black vehicle. At the same time, they're trying to search the area, but also they set up a roadblock to see if maybe somebody else along the way had seen anything. And of course, they're stopping every vehicle, and nobody has seen anything.
Investigators catch a break when a county employee doing road work in the area comes forward with an eyewitness account of an odd encounter with a black Ford Bronco.
The county road grader operator, he'd been actually working the road that day, And he had met a black car, a black four-wheel drive Bronco or a Blazer, he said. He'd met it 3 times in the space of about 2 or 3 hours at various spots near that home.
He says he was coming one direction on the road. A black vehicle was coming the other direction, and it was a very distinct vehicle because you could tell even from a distance it was flat black. It was all completely black. But when that vehicle got about 100 yards away, it did a U-turn, went into the ditch, and went the other way. So he thought, well, that's odd. And he's grading the road, and a couple hours later he comes back, and that same vehicle is coming from a different direction, now from an east-west direction. And he noticed where it went. And then later on, when he ate his lunch, he saw that that vehicle was parked by the Striley house.
He panics. What he did at the house when he went the first time was leave his name and phone number. He knows that this is going to come out, so he rushes back to the house to try to get that note. He's now trying to cover up these spontaneous things he did during this abduction to keep him from being caught. He's disguised his vehicle with a flat black paint substance, the entire vehicle. The little girl, when he kidnaps Piper the first time, sees this black vehicle. When he panics to come back, he passes a county road worker. There's numerous people now seeing this black vehicle, which the police can now link to her disappearance. It's the first break they've had, and it will turn into a bigger break as the investigation goes on.
Late in the evening, Vance remembers something. He remembers that the previous Friday, there had been a man who showed up at the house about 7:30 in the morning, and he was driving a black car with black wheels. And Vance described him as a guy who was late 20s, early 30s. And Vance had a conversation with this guy who indicated that he was there to try to get his kids into Bible school. Vance also remembers that the guy said his name was Robert Anderson.
Police managed to take the information that Piper's husband can remember. And through some overnight investigation, police managed to track down a name, Robert Leroy Anderson, as a very likely suspect. Police catch a critical break when they connect the dots with Anderson's family and track down the phone number of Robert's father, Leland Anderson.
Even though it's now almost 2:30 in the morning, one of the investigators calls that number. A woman groggily answers the phone, and the investigator just makes up a story.
One of the investigators says, "Hi, my name is such and such. I know it's late at night, but I'm looking for Robert Anderson. I'm working on buying a car from him. Do you know Robert Anderson?" And she says, "Well, yes, that's my son's name." And he says, "Well, is he there? Can I talk to him?" And she says, "Well, no, he's not here. He's at work at Morell's right now." And when the investigators hear Morell's right away, it brings back memories to them of Larissa Dumansky disappearing from Morell's.
The disappearance of Larissa Dumansky 2 years earlier from the Morell's parking lot is suddenly brought into focus, and police waste no time going to the location to look for Anderson's vehicle.
So they go to Morell's and they find the vehicle because they now have the plate. The problem is it's not black. It is a royal blue with a white racing stripe on both sides of the vehicle. So it's clearly not a black on black vehicle. Well, they don't know what to do with that, but they decide they better keep an eye on this guy, so they have somebody stay there until he gets off work.
It's a completely different color than all the witnesses have described to this point, which is the county worker, the child, the husband, have all described a flat black vehicle. It causes a tenuous moment for the police. Now they have to figure out what is going on here. Is this true? Is it false? Why has this vehicle changed color so rapidly?
They stake out the Morell's parking lot, and they wait until Robert Leroy Anderson gets off work. They follow him to see where he goes, but he ends up going to his home and going in and going to bed.
The investigator, who is very seasoned, goes to Robert Leroy Anderson's house and says, "Hi, I'm Officer so-and-so," and says, "I'd like you to come down to the police station and answer some questions." And Robert Leroy Anderson says, "Okay." And right away, the investigator sees red flags. When somebody comes to your house and says, I want to question you at the police station, you say, why? What happened? Am I a suspect? What's going on? And he was just so calm about it.
And he voluntarily comes down and agrees to an interview.
The detectives inch closer to the truth, but still they are struggling to connect the black vehicle witnesses saw at the Striley residence with the shiny blue and white model that Anderson has driven to the police station.
They asked him some questions about the vehicle. They basically said, have you washed it? Well, he said, no, but I recently painted it about 6 weeks ago, and I've been purposefully not washing it until the paint sets.
This is a critical piece of the puzzle, but it still doesn't add up. Anderson offers a weak explanation about painting his vehicle weeks ago, but the suspected vehicle in the abduction, spotted just 1 day earlier, was flat black. His story isn't adding up, and the detectives know it.
And now they tell Robert Lee Ray Anderson, we have search warrants. We don't like some of the things we're hearing. You're going to have to stay at a motel with your family. We want to search your resident, and we're going to search your Bronco. They find a couple of toolboxes. One of the toolboxes, the investigators named it the torture box. It had ether in it to knock somebody out. It had eye rings. It had bindings. They find the homemade bondage board.
We also found a cash register receipt for Kraft paint that was purchased on Thursday. 16-ounce liquid bottle. And it looked like it's black finger paint is what it is. It's water-based paint that kids use for watercolors and that sort of stuff. And in the vehicle they found lots of property in there that had black paint on it. They found several spots on the vehicle where there were runs of black paint.
It's just like when you wash your car and you're all done and you have little bits of suds in the cracks. He couldn't wash it all away.
One of the DC agents took the receipt and went to the store where the purchase had been made and said, what is this stuff? And the gal said, well, that's 16-ounce black water-based paint. Showed him a bottle. And he said, if you thinned that out and painted it on a car, would it wash off? And she said, you know, you're the second person this week who's asked me that.
And the other person had said that they were in there, they were going to paint a friend's car as a prank. They say, well, if we showed you a picture of this person, could you identify him?
And she picked out Robert Anderson as the guy who had bought the black paint on the previous Thursday.
That's your moment of fame right there. The second time, who else asked? Robert Lee Ray Anderson. There's no saying, I'd rather be lucky than be good. It pays to be both. You have to have luck in police source.
Robert Leroy Anderson's story is now unraveling quickly. The police uncover a wealth of damning evidence inside his Bronco and find even more at his home. For a suspect to paint their vehicle temporarily, however, seems beyond the pale. Investigators need to prove it can be done.
Now, they weren't sure that they could paint an entire Bronco with a half a bottle of that paint. So they bought another bottle, and the guys in the lab borrowed a red and white Bronco from one of their buddies. And they thinned it out, and they painted it in about 20 minutes and had it black.
Law enforcement, everything's time. Time is your enemy, time is your friend, and it's a ticking clock, and it just goes. And every bit of evidence you get is so important. And when you finally get that one piece, you have to act quickly.
And then they took it to a car wash and used a wand on it and had it clean in 7 minutes.
Investigations can go on for days, months, years. There's always that critical hour, I call it the hour you live for, when everything you think and plan or are given comes together. And it's that bang, bang, bang inside of an hour time space that you're able to recreate, prove, and then eventually convict the person committing these horrible crimes.
Like many investigations, luck seems to be the key ingredient to solving the case. But in this instance, police create their own luck through persistence and following the smallest of hunches. A receipt for paint. A truck's color which didn't match the suspect's. A hardware store clerk with a story to tell. All of these things put police in the right place at the right time. Within an hour of testing their theory, the case against Anderson builds. Without a doubt, he is guilty. And this monster can finally be locked behind bars, where he belongs. On this warm Sunday evening in August, Frances Thompson is home alone when she hears a car pull up outside. She isn't expecting any company. But when longtime friend, Dean Frank, shows up out of the blue, Frances fears for her life.
They've been friends for years, but lately the relationship has taken a turn. Dean's behavior has become increasingly threatening.
Things escalate quickly, and the altercation turns deadly.
It's an hour that you have to be at your best behavior as a police officer. You've got to be alert, you have to investigate, and you have to play self-defense at the same time.
As investigators struggle to piece together what happened that led to this shooting,
it's a tragedy that will both shock and puzzle the community. And only by understanding the events in this key hour of the murder does the truth really come to light. One of the most shocking statistics is that over 50% of murders are committed by people who know the victim. And of those, half are in a familial or intimate relationship. It's enough to make you wonder, who do you know that is capable of such a horrendous act? When it comes to Frances Thompson, a widow with a bent toward activism and animal rights, killer seems like a moniker that shouldn't stick. But as authorities step through a key hour in this case, the murder of her friend and companion, Dean Frank, and the circumstances surrounding their relationship brings the crime into focus. The Thompsons' farm is located 20 miles northwest of the small village of Verdigre, Nebraska, in Knox County. It's a remote area, surrounded on all sides by farmland. Verdigre is a 2-hour drive from the capital, Lincoln, Nebraska. It's an isolated village of only 555 people. It boasts a high Czech population, and as the Kolash capital of the world, embraces its Czech origins by hosting a festival every June to celebrate the fruity Kolash pastry.
Knox County is in northeast Nebraska. The northern border is the Missouri River, which up here is a little over a mile wide, mostly an agricultural area. We have a lot of tourism because of the river and the state parks.
Dean Frank and Frances Thompson have been friends for over 5 years. Over the past few months, the two have toyed with the idea of taking that friendship to the next level. But recently, Frances has cold feet and begins to fear Dean is pursuing her too aggressively. In 1985, Frances Thompson moves in with her mother and son into a farmhouse 20 miles northwest of Verdigre after her husband dies in a construction accident. It's a chance for Frances and her teenage son to start over.
Frances meets Dean Frank, a man a few years older than her who used to be a farmer and is living in Atkinson, a few hours away.
Like a lot of farmers, when the farm crisis hit, he had difficulties.
Frances' mother pays Dean to come by and do odd jobs around the farm. And on the occasions where he works into the evening, he stays overnight in a spare bedroom upstairs. He and Frances develop a close friendship.
But clearly something happens between them that leads to this violent altercation, resulting in Francis shooting Dean.
Dean Frank lies wounded on Frances Thompson's kitchen floor. As he bleeds out, Frances calls 911. She tells the operator that she shot Dean in self-defense, claiming that he threatened her.
He came in, he lunged at her and said, "I'm going to kill you," or something to that effect, and she shot him.
Time is of the essence as officers make their way to the farmhouse, hoping to arrive in time to save Dean's life.
Not long after Frances moves onto the farm, she buys a pig and names him Arthur.
She was, I guess you would say, an animal rights activist in a small way.
She was active in some of the political things. She was against a proposed chicken farm by Bloomfield.
If she could rescue every animal destined for slaughter, she would, which leads to her dream of converting the property into an organic farm.
In the summer of 1988, Frances goes away to attend the university in Lincoln, Nebraska, studying environmental law. Dean's main task becomes the care and well-being of looking after Frances' pet pig, Arthur, while she's gone.
By 1991, Frances has been studying environmental law at Lincoln for 3 years. She's a straight-A student, passionate about animal rights and environmental protection. She may be older than a lot of students in her classes, but this is the life transformation Frances was searching for after the death of her husband.
Frances' son is now grown and away from the farm, attending Naval Academy.
In the summer of 91, after classes finish and Frances returns from the university in Lincoln, her friendship with Dean blossoms into romance.
The last man Frances is with is her husband, and she's been closed off to the idea of romance since his passing. But now that her son is grown, she's put down roots, and is close to a new career in environmental law, she thinks it may be time to entertain the idea of opening up her heart.
Over that summer, Dean and Frances spend more and more time together as their feelings for each other build.
Frances wants to take things slowly, however. She hasn't been with another man since her husband, and has some reservations about getting into a sexual relationship.
Dean doesn't have the same reservations. In fact, over that summer, he proposes several times. The first proposal isn't overly romantic. In fact, he positions it as a business opportunity.
Unsurprisingly, Frances doesn't go for Dean's proposal.
An avid letter writer, she writes to her son at the Naval Academy, expressing her fears that Dean is just using her to get to her farm. She signs off saying, "Remember, I may whine and cry, but I is a tough old lady and a damn good shot too."
But Dean is persistent and won't take no for an answer. He continues to try persuading Frances that she should marry him.
As the tenor of Dean's activities become more threatening, she contacts the local sheriff and advises him that she is getting phone calls from him that are threatening. He advises her to maintain a log and to keep track of the things that he's saying to her. On August the 18th, 1991, she contacts the sheriff again about obtaining a restraining order. He advises her that she has to wait till the following day because it is a Sunday and she can only file for the order on a Monday.
Not long after calling the sheriff, Frances hears Dean's car outside. He's come unannounced.
Frances keeps 2 guns in the house. One is a .357 Magnum, a very powerful handgun, and she keeps it very close to her.
Frances Thompson's farm is located 20 miles northwest of the small village of Verdigre, Nebraska, in Knox County. Moving to the farm is the chance for Frances and her son to start over after the death of her husband. Though Frances isn't a farmer, she befriends Dean Frank, a local man who's been affected by the farming crisis of the 80s.
Over the next few years, the friendship between Dean and Frances deepens, and in the summer of 1991, they begin a romantic courtship.
But on August 18th, after weeks of Dean trying to convince Frances to marry him, he becomes aggressive and threatens her.
Frances warns Dean. When he doesn't back down, she opens fire.
It's been nearly 15 minutes since Frances shoots Dean in self-defense. The nearest squad car is almost an hour away. All Frances can do is wait for help to arrive.
Investigators will later learn that Frances is trained in first aid by the Red Cross, but she has yet to offer any assistance to Dean, who is incapacitated and bleeding to death on her floor.
It appears after being shot he's no longer a threat. She has the training to help stop the bleeding. However, for some reason, she does not try to.
If she's afraid for her safety, it's understandable she'd be hesitant to help. But is Dean really a dangerous threat?
Since moving to the farm in 1985, Frances and Dean have slowly built a friendship.
She said for 6 years he was a perfect gentleman. They had a non-sexual friendship and occasional odd job employer relationship.
But Dean wants more than just friendship.
Frances is hesitant because she hasn't had a sexual relationship with anyone since her husband's passing.
The following week, Frances writes to Dean saying that she has some concerns. Dean has had other partners in the past, and before she feels safe entering into a sexual relationship with him, she'd like them both to be tested for STIs and AIDS.
On July 3rd, 1991, Dean and Frances jointly visit a physician in Verdigre to get tested.
She also would write letters saying that she was very much of two minds about whether or not to resume a sexual relationship with a man.
On July 12th, Frances visits Dean at his trailer to deliver the results. The test came back negative. They spend the next 3 nights in his trailer.
After Frances returns home, she writes Dean a letter.
She says in her letter, "I put way too much energy into antagonizing about letting sex back into my life. Guess it ain't for you, but for me, it was the biggest change in lifestyle imaginable." Presumably, Dean isn't taking the new direction of their relationship as seriously as Frances.
About a week later, on January 22nd, Frances calls Dean and tells him that for their relationship to work, she needs to meet his ex-wife and children.
Dean apparently finds this to be a strange request and gets upset. This is a red flag to Frances.
Over the next week, there are several calls exceeding 30 minutes between the two, as well as letter correspondence.
As the summer progressed, she also started to double-check. She contacted Dean's ex-girlfriend in O'Neill, wanted to know about Dean as a boyfriend. She contacted the ex-wife who would have had Dean's 4 children and contacted her several times, at least twice, about Dean as a boyfriend.
While Dean appears eager to make up for Frances and take their relationship to the next level, her letters to her son and friends suggest that she doesn't trust him and thinks he's hiding details of his past relationships in order to make her jealous.
She said that he grew interested in having a sexual relationship with her and talked about marriage, that he would quit his job and work on the farm with her, and that they could do organic farming, which was coming into vogue back in that period of time.
Frances is suspicious that Dean has ulterior motives, that if he really cared about her and not just her farm, he'd open up about his past instead of feeding her jealousy.
Over the next few days, Frances sees a change in Dean. He's exhibiting strange behavior, and she's worried about her safety and brushes up on her firearm skills.
She had actually purchased ammunition from the local hardware store 3 times. She had taken training to become a private investigator and a security guard.
The investigation showed that she had a couple guns, but 2 guns were seized during the investigation, a .357 Magnum and I believe a .25 Auto, Beretta .25 Auto. If I remember right, the investigation actually showed that at times Fran would keep those guns in a safety deposit box at the local bank. And prior to the homicide, the .357 Magnum and the .25 Auto were apparently taken out of the safety deposit box, were taken to the farmstead, to the house. She practiced with both handguns. There was evidence to indicate that.
It's been over 20 minutes since Francis shot Dean. He's lost a lot of blood, and by now the pain would be excruciating. He's still conscious.
I'm holding in my hands a .357 Magnum shell. This is a .22 caliber shell. In the police world, this is considered a people stopper. This is considered a very light caliber bullet, incapable of doing much damage unless it hits you in a vital organ. This travels out of the barrel at 1,450 feet per second. This one around 1,000. So the comparison for civilian terms would be being hit with a tennis ball on the forehead at 100 miles an hour. You're going to survive. Getting hit with this is like getting hit with a baseball at 100 miles an hour. You are not going to recover.
As officers race to the crime scene, they're aware of how much time has passed. They don't know yet the severity of Dean's wounds, but they do know that they still have many miles to go before they reach him. And the question of whether or not he'll still be alive by the time they get there is anyone's guess. Over the summer of 1991, the years-long friendship between Dean Frank and Frances Thompson takes a romantic turn.
Dean proposes to Frances several times, but she wants to take things slow.
After Dean refuses to introduce Frances to his ex and his children, she grows suspicious and pulls away.
According to Frances, this enrages Dean and he begins making threats.
Fearing for her safety, Frances buys ammo for her 2 handguns and spends some time target practicing. And on August 18th, things escalate when Dean comes over unannounced and utters threats.
According to Frances, she warns Dean to back off. When he doesn't, she shoots him.
It's been minutes since Dean was shot. He moans in pain, unable to move. Feeling sympathy for him, Frances places a cushion under his head to make him more comfortable.
Given his injuries, it's unlikely that he poses any threat to Frances. Why she doesn't help him, she's under stress, shock. It's unknown why she doesn't try to help him. It's an extremely traumatic situation.
What happened between these two that led to this violent encounter?
Not long ago, they were considering marriage, and now Dean lies dying on her floor.
Over the past week, the calls from Dean became increasingly threatening.
She adds that on August the 5th, she had spoken to Doris Fisher, Dean's ex-girlfriend, who advised her that at one point in their relationship, he had been drunk, threatened her, and was apparently telling her he was going to slit her throat. This made her think that it was time to end the relationship with Dean and to protect herself.
A few days after this phone call, she finds Dean on the property, fixing Arthur the pig's irrigation pipe. It's at this time that she allegedly tells him never to come back to her farm. In the present hour, the situation is dire. It's hard to understand why things have unfolded the way they have. But now Dean is lying on the floor, bleeding out quickly.
Everybody's different, and everybody has a different tolerance for trauma. If someone's bleeding out in close proximity, a witness might jump in to help, they might run for help, they might sit there and panic. You don't know until you're in the situation.
But then something unexpected allegedly occurs. Dean uses his energy to communicate with authorities, even if he cannot speak for himself.
If someone's been shot, particularly with a higher caliber bullet, it's not like in the movies. People feel pain. They become incapacitated. You'd have to be quite a powerful person that was already in fight or flight mode to be able to move after being shot, especially in the abdomen 3 times.
Meanwhile, authorities continue traveling toward the shooting, aware of the time and distance to get there.
It can be stressful. It's an unknown. Like, you have no idea what you're getting into in most 911 calls, except in an urban setting, you know there's support nearby. When you're on your own going out into a rural area, you have to have your wits about you. And usually in a rural setting, there's darkness, there's lack of lighting, there's unknown surroundings. You're not familiar with the area because you don't patrol it all the time. Whereas in an urban setting, I'm going to 55 First Street. I know that area. I've been there all my life. I go to a rural setting 40 miles away. I may never have been to this place. I don't know who's there. I don't know what's there. For the police officer, the next thing is backup. Do I have people coming to help? Because you're traveling far away from your headquarters or your office. Plus, you don't know the services you need when you get there. Do you need forensic backup? Do you need medical backup? Do you need fire? You don't know what you're getting into, and you're always the first one on the scene.
It has been almost 30 minutes since Francis shot Dean. He is still alive, but losing blood quickly.
This is a real traumatic hour for Dean and Francis. He's been shot. The clock is ticking within this hour. She doesn't know if he's going to live or die before the police get there, which requires her to make another decision within that hour. Dean may die from the initial shots, but she can't take that chance. He may talk to the police when they arrive. So she now has to make a very difficult decision.
This decision would ultimately be the key to solving what happened before the police arrived.
Like many calls, the officers responding don't have a lot of information. They would have had a call to active shooting. She claims to 911 or whoever she contacted that it was self-defense. So they arrive and they have to worry, is she hurt? What's the condition of the person that's involved in the shooting? What is the circumstances going to be when they get there? So they have to enter with caution, look to treat someone that may be injured, see where that gun is. You want to secure that gun immediately because you don't want anybody else getting shot. It's an hour that you have to be at your best behavior as a police officer. You've got to be alert, you have to investigate, and you have to play self-defense at the same time. It's a very intense hour during that killing.
When officers finally arrive, they find Dean unresponsive, though he still has a discernible pulse. Because it's a shooting, paramedics can't do anything until officers clear the scene.
Paramedics arrive and attempt CPR, but all attempts at resuscitation on Dean are futile. He's deemed dead at 7 p.m.
Standard procedure in these things is to ask the shooter to come in for questioning. And she's very quick to point out that there's a message written in blood beside Dean, who's laying on the floor.
So when the deputies get to this house, there's written in blood on the floor next to Dean where he's laying, self-defense, and his blood printed on the floor.
This will become one of the more puzzling aspects of this case.
Sheriff Eisenbeiss interviews Frances to try and understand her history with Dean, and what led to the use of deadly force. Frances is cooperative in explaining that, over the past week, the calls from Dean became increasingly threatening.
She buys ammunition for her gun and practices shooting targets to brush up on her skills.
For these police officers, the weapons training, the log of the abusive calls, the fact she had filed for the restraining order, gives them total justification that this possibly could be self-defense, combined with this message in blood on the floor. However, once they start looking at the timeline and the details within that very important hour, There's holes in this case.
For instance, when asked if Dean breaks into her house, Frances says no. The front door is unlocked and he comes in with a bag of groceries, which he puts away in the fridge.
She also claims that she heard Dean's car approaching. She gets up, arms herself. He enters the house and the shooting occurs. It begs the question, if she heard the car coming, why didn't she lock the door and take evasive measures?
When I entered the house, I seen no signs of a forced entry. I didn't see any signs of a struggle inside, which I thought was kind of strange. Everything appeared to be like it should be. There wasn't any sign of people rolling around fighting. There wasn't any sign of a door kicked in.
The sheriff questions Frances about the message written in blood.
Frances claims that Dean wrote this message in blood in his own hand to prove her innocence in the case, indicating that he still loved her evidently and didn't want her to get in trouble. And this begs a question, why would he do that to the police? It's a big red flag.
As investigators search the house, the message in blood isn't the only handwritten note they find, supposedly absolving Frances of any wrongdoing.
They find a note written in pencil with the words, "I love Fran, self-defense, and I love you."
There was some writing in blood. All I could make out at the time was the word self was wrote in blood on the floor, and there was some hand scribbled type messages on paper, something to the effect of self-defense, or it was very poorly spelled, hard to read.
This is all very strange, and one can't help but wonder, did Frances write this herself? She could be concerned that her story about Dean's threatening calls and supposed aggressive movement towards her are not enough to convince a jury, so she writes these messages.
If the shooting is justified, she still has a lot of time to sit with her thoughts while she waits for help to arrive.
Up until recently, she and Dean have been close. It's not hard to imagine that she probably starts regretting her actions. After all, she can hear Dean dying just a few feet away.
The crime scene evidence would suggest that Dean never wrote the message in blood.
There was no blood on his left hand or left fingers at all.
This becomes very important later on, as these are written with a right-hand lean and he is left-handed.
Whether or not Frances wrote the message in blood isn't the only detail troubling investigators. There are other elements of the case that aren't adding up.
For whatever reason, in her statement to the sheriff, Frances claims that Dean was crawling around on the floor. But evidence at the scene clearly shows that the blood is contained to the one area where Dean was shot and went down.
Dean's been shot 3 times with a .357 Magnum. He's extremely injured, so why does Fran tell the police a different version of the events?
As puzzling as the inconsistencies, or perhaps the outright fabrications, in Frances's testimony are, they're nothing compared to what the autopsy is about to reveal.
Frances tells the sheriff that when Dean refused to heed her warnings, she shot him 3 times in rapid succession in the abdomen. The medical examiner confirms that Dean is shot 3 times, but only once from the front. The other 2 shots were inflicted from behind.
Officers arrive at Frances Thompson's home and find Dean Frank still alive and bleeding out in her kitchen. Frances claims she acted in self-defense. However, officers notice strange notes allegedly written by Dean. With no other witnesses to the shooting, officers accept her story at first, but autopsy evidence is about to undo her credibility. As detectives look at the autopsy results, they see that the report tells a very different story than the one Frances has been telling.
The shot to the lower left abdomen from the front occurred 30 or 40 minutes before death, that there were changes around the wound that indicated that the person was alive and the body was dealing with this wound. veins would show up with discoloration. And then he also testified and had told us after the autopsy that the one gunshot from the back that went through the liver and the lung and exited the body, that the damage it did to the liver would have been such that he would have died within 5 to 10, 15 minutes at the most after getting that gunshot wound.
In light of the evidence, the police know that she did not fire 3 shots directly at him at the time of the shooting.
Looking at the forensic evidence, we construct a timeline of what actually happened. Frances shoots Dean once at 5:35 p.m., then calls 911 to report that she shot him in self-defense.
Question is, what happens between the first shot and the time that officers arrive almost an hour later?
When detectives arrive at the scene, they know that Dean is shot 3 times. By going through the autopsy with the pathologist, they're able to determine that he probably died from the shot to the liver. However, that shot was delivered sometime after the initial 2 shots. This now requires law enforcement officers to go back and recreate a timeline from the time of the 911 call, the shooting was reported, when did this 3rd shot take place?
Officers now have to operate under the assumption that Frances has been lying to them, and that her version of events can't be trusted.
What likely happens is that when Dean arrives with the groceries, since the door was unlocked and Frances was armed, she was probably expecting him. It wasn't a surprise visit like she claimed because she was ready for a confrontation. He's putting groceries in the fridge when she calls to him. Once he turns around, she shoots him once. Dean goes down, totally incapacitated by the gunshot, and Frances calls 911, claiming she shot him in self-defense.
Dean lies face down, unable to move, though still breathing. Frances points the gun and shoots him 2 times, point blank in the back. By some stroke of misfortune for her, Dean survives, and before she can do anything about it, officers arrive on the scene.
The original plan may have worked if Dean had died. 1 shot could look like self-defense. But when Frances has to shoot him again, the plan isn't going the way she anticipated. This is probably why she writes the words self-defense in blood and claims that Dean wrote it.
As you can imagine, there's a lot of excitement. And I don't mean excitement in a we're happy type excitement. It's just there's a lot of going on. You're going from almost like 20 miles an hour to 150 miles an hour like that. So the scene is secure. Everything is going on. It's obvious Dean Frank has been shot. It's obvious he's getting treatment. When I entered the house, I seen no signs of a forced entry. I didn't see any signs of a struggle inside, which I thought was kind of strange. Everything appeared to be like it should be. There wasn't any sign of people rolling around fighting. There wasn't any sign of a door kicked in. Nothing that would indicate somebody came in and attacked somebody.
The .357 Magnum is a hand cannon. It's a very loud gun, louder than most. She knows if the police pull in the driveway, she cannot put the finishing shot into him. It has to be done before the police get close to the residence.
She had called in and said that she had shot him, and he's not dying. You've got notes written in blood, you've got notes written on paper, and he's not dying. And it's reasonable to believe she heard sirens from the rescue squad, and he's not dying. It's reasonable to believe when the deputies were en route, by policy, they'd have been running red lights and siren, and he's not dying. We also had a couple boys playing golf who'd heard some shots, and the shots were very, very spaced out. And now she's got a story, and she's got self-defense, and she's got everything lined up. And so there is a shot that's fired that had to be the last shot. He's got 3 holes in him, three rounds that went through him. 3 rounds are in the floor. He's not dying. We know if he was shot in front of an emergency room door and wheeled in the emergency room, the pathologist, the expert would have testified he's not going to live more than 5 to 7 minutes. And he's alive when the deputies go in and when rescue squad, the EMS goes in, but he's dying. And he dies before he reaches Verdigris, Nebraska. He's pronounced dead. So it's not like TV. You don't just shoot somebody and they die.
Francis shoots Dean 3 times, hoping that by the time help arrives, he'll be gone. But he manages somehow to cling to life.
The fact that officers find Dean still alive when they arrive is the nail in the coffin for Francis's defense. From the pathologist's report, we know that he would have survived only minutes after being struck in the liver. This tells police that Francis's self-defense claim is fabricated. It's a cover.
While investigators may not have a motive for why Francis killed Dean, they know at least one thing. It's no accident. They charge her with first-degree murder. The community is shocked to find out that animal-loving environmentalist Francis Thompson is being charged with first-degree murder.
Her defense team is hoping that they can use her history and standing in the community to make her seem sympathetic. On the other hand, they set out to make Dean seem like a man with a history of threatening behavior. They enter into evidence the letters that Francis wrote describing her fear of Dean and his increasingly threatening phone calls.
Her lawyers attempt to dissuade the jury of any notion that Francis is jealous and wants to keep Dean. In a letter where Francis alludes to being jealous and in love with Dean, the defense claims that Francis only means she loves him as a friend, and that when she says jealous, what she really means is disgusted.
They paint a picture that Dean is the one obsessed with Fran. She has no romantic interest in him whatsoever. He's pursuing her, threatening to cause harm, which gives her the justification for the self-defense motive that she has come up with. However, the facts paint a completely different picture.
Whatever claims the defense makes, they're contradicted by the actual evidence in this case. Even the threatening phone calls are only alleged. Francis has no audio recordings or other proof that Dean actually made these phone calls. Francis has painted herself as the victim, but the truth is she shot her friend, and while he was dying mere feet from her, she shot him 2 more times.
It was an event that doesn't happen a lot in Knox County as far as trials go and stuff, and so it was a long drawn-out trial. In the end, the jury came back with a verdict, and the verdict was that she was guilty of the homicide.
Judge sentences Francis to life imprisonment for first-degree murder, with an additional 10 years for her firearm charge, the sentences to run consecutively.
Ultimately, Francis even had the chance to right her wrong. When the first shot didn't kill Dean, she could have used her Red Cross training to slow the blood loss and save him. But instead, she doubled down and shot him 2 more times. This shows premeditation and a lack of remorse.
The community of Verdigris and surrounding Knox County is shocked by the trial and the outcome.
In this case, a person that moved to the community murdered a person born and raised in the community, and of course that rocks people too. You know, somebody you see every day, now they're dead, now they're murdered. The person that they were with a lot is accused of that murder, and in a small community, it's hard.
It's hard to understand this crime because the motive really isn't clear. What did Francis stand to gain? Here's someone, a straight-A student, pursuing her passion in environmental studies. Why did she throw it all away?